On a quiet Christmas Eve in rural Oregon, a young waitress named Delaney offers soup to an old man who seems like just another drifter until he utters words that connect him to her late father, a man who quietly shaped history. What begins as an act of kindness unfolds into a legacy of heroism, secrecy, and lifelong debts repaid in silence. As Delaney uncovers the hidden truth about her father's service and the mysterious Colonel Monroe, she finds her own path forward, becoming a doctor and founding a tradition of compassion that echoes across generations. Welcome to my channel. I was 24 that Christmas Eve, and I still remember the way the snow fell, soft, steady, and so quiet it made the world feel paused. I'd picked up a part-time waitressing job at a roadside cafe in Eastern Oregon. The kind of place with vinyl booths, a jukebox that hadn't worked in years, and a neon sign that hummed when the wind picked up. The Evergreen Cafe, we called it, even though the only green around those parts came from faded road signs and pine needles trapped in frozen gutters. I'd been living with my mom in a second-floor apartment that always smelled like peppermint and old paperbacks. She was still grieving. We both were. Dad passed away that past December, Christmas Eve, of all nights. It was a sudden heart attack, no warning. One moment he was helping me string lights on the porch, and the next, well, everything changed. He'd been a quiet man, proud but soft around the edges. He never said much about his years in the service, but I knew there were things he carried that didn't show up in family photos. The cafe was nearly empty that night. Most of our regulars had already gone home, probably nestled in flannel pajamas with sugar cookies and reruns of It's a Wonderful Life. All that remained were a couple of travelers in thick coats nursing bottomless mugs of coffee and the occasional slice of cherry pie. I was wiping down the counter when the bell over the door chimed. In stepped an old man, bundled in a threadbare jacket, boots scuffed down to leather, and hair long and silver, trailing out from beneath a wool cap. His presence didn't demand attention, but it shifted the air. Like how a room changes when someone important walks in but doesn't say a word. "We're closing in 15, Ray," the manager muttered without looking up from the register. I could tell he was ready to bolt home, his mind already in front of a fireplace with his feet up and the game on mute. I hesitated. I don't know why. Maybe it was the way the man looked around the place, like he'd been here before in another life. Maybe it was just the way Christmas does that thing to your heart when you least expect it. "I'll take care of him, Ray," I said, wiping my hands on a towel. Ray grunted but didn't protest. "Your tip jar." I led the man to the window booth, the one where the colored lights from the shop across the street painted lazy reds and greens across the table. "What can I get you?" I asked, notebook in hand. He looked up at me with pale, cloudy eyes. "Some soup, if it's still warm. And maybe a glass of water." That voice, raspy, barely above a whisper, felt like wine through pine needles. Fragile but steady. I hurried back to the kitchen. Most of the food had been packed away, but I found a pot of potato soup still on the warmer. I ladled out more than usual and dug out the last gingerbread cookie from the display, the one shaped like a snowman, its red and green icing slightly smudged. When I returned, I set it all down gently. "I added the cookie," I said. "No one should go without something sweet on Christmas Eve." He wrapped his hands around the bowl like it was the only warmth left in the world. "That's very kind," he said. "I don't have much to give in return." I smiled, brushing a curl from my forehead. "Neither do I. But hungry's no way to spend Christmas." He ate slowly, like each bite meant something. And I swear, every time I passed by to check on the other tables, his eyes followed the room with a strange familiarity, as if he was memorizing everything. When I came back to clear his empty bowl, he looked up, and something in his gaze made me pause. His eyes locked on mine, and in a voice barely audible over the jukebox static, he said, "You remind me of someone who saved my life." I didn't know what to say. I laughed nervously. "I'm sorry." He leaned in a little closer, and his next words, "I'll never forget them. You are your father's daughter in every way." I froze. Goosebumps rippled up my arms. Dad. 10 months gone. A man who never bragged, never shared much about his past, especially not about the war. How did this stranger know anything about him? About me? Before I could even gather a question, the man stood slowly, placed a carefully folded $5 bill on the table, more than the soup cost by far, and gave me a single nod. "Merry Christmas, Miss Delaney." And then he turned and walked back out into the snow. I rushed to the door, but the street was empty. No footprints on the sidewalk, no retreating figure. Just the snow falling softly, like nothing had happened at all. Back at the booth, beneath the bill, was a small folded note. It read, Thank you for doing the right thing. Some debts take a lifetime to repay. That night, after locking up the cafe and trudging home through a foot of fresh snow, I walked into our apartment with that note still clutched in my hand. Mom was decorating the tree, a little artificial one we'd picked up at a garage sale years ago. She had Dad's old flannel shirt draped over the couch like a blanket, and Vince Guaraldi was playing softly on the radio. I waited until we were both sitting on the floor, untangling a string of lights that had seen better days. I met someone tonight, I said, trying to sound casual. Mom glanced up from her pile of ornaments. You meet lots of people, honey. It's a cafe. No, I said. This was different. I told her everything. The man's eyes. His voice. The way he looked at me when he said I reminded him of someone who'd saved his life. I recited the note word for word. And when I repeated what he'd said, you are your father's daughter in every way, I watched the color drain from her face. She set the ornament in her lap and sat still, as if she were listening for something far away. What did he look like? She asked. I described him the best I could. Long silver hair, face like worn leather, eyes that saw everything. He was probably in his late 70s, maybe early 80s. Mom just stared at the tree for a long while, then said softly, That sounds like Colonel Everett. I blinked. Who? She got up and disappeared into the back room. When she returned, she was holding an old photo, faded, edges curled. It showed Dad in his army uniform, younger than I'd ever seen him, standing beside a taller man with silver-streaked hair and a serious expression. There was a jeep behind them, a field of bare trees, and what looked like frost clinging to their gear. Your dad served under him in Germany, she said. He only ever referred to him as the colonel. Said the man saved his whole unit once. But your father didn't talk much about those years. Said it was all classified. That photo's the only thing he kept from his service. I held the picture closer, and sure enough, the old man from the cafe looked just like the one beside my dad. But how would he know me? I whispered. I've never seen him before in my life. Mom reached over and squeezed my hand. Because your dad never stopped talking about you. 3 days later, I was on the morning shift, wiping down the counter and humming along to some old Johnny Cash song when the bell above the door rang. This time, it wasn't a drifter or a traveler looking for warmth. It was a man in a black coat with military posture and eyes that didn't miss a thing. Delaney Cooper? He asked. I nodded, my mouth dry. He introduced himself as Raymond Locke, said he worked for a division called Special Recognition Affairs within the Department of Veterans Affairs. We'd like to speak with you privately, he added, producing a badge I didn't dare question. In the storeroom behind the kitchen, where the smell of bacon grease clung to the walls, he opened a small binder and removed a photo in a plastic sleeve. It was a black and white image from the early 70s. A young soldier, my dad, was dragging a wounded man through what looked like snow and pine needles. The wounded man's uniform was torn, his arm limp, but his face. It was him. The old man from the cafe. That's Sergeant Cooper, Locke said. Your father. The man he's rescuing is Colonel Everett Monroe, one of the most valuable assets in Cold War operations along the East German border. I just stared at it, my heart hammering against my ribs. So, it really was him? We believe so, Locke replied. Colonel Monroe disappeared shortly after his retirement in 1989. Officially listed as missing, presumed deceased. But we've been keeping an open file. You see, Miss Cooper, Colonel Monroe made a vow after your father saved his life. A life debt, he called it. He said, and I quote, I will watch over the Cooper family, always. He pulled out another photo, this one a grainy shot from our cafe security camera. It was the same booth, the same Christmas Eve. Monroe, hunched in that same threadbare jacket, had bowed toward a small photo I keep taped inside my order book, an old picture of Dad. The timestamp, December 24th, 11:52 p.m. Locke leaned in, his voice lowering. That night, he came to fulfill that promise. I sat back in my chair, the room tilting just slightly. The soup. The cookie. The way he said my full name when I hadn't worn my name tag. None of it had been coincidence. That simple act of kindness, feeding an old man soup on Christmas Eve, wasn't the beginning of the story. It was the end of one chapter and the quiet beginning of another. I didn't sleep much that night. My brain kept looping back to that photo, Dad pulling the colonel through snow and shadows, both of them younger than I'd ever seen them. I kept thinking about how quiet Dad had been about his past, how the biggest chapters of his life had remained closed until someone else came along and opened them for me. 2 days after the visit from Raymond Locke, a government vehicle showed up outside our apartment. Plain black sedan, plates with numbers that didn't make sense. When I opened the door, a woman in uniform stepped out, boots polished, her hat tucked neatly under her arm. "Miss Cooper," she said, offering a salute I wasn't sure I was supposed to return. "I'm Lieutenant Adair. We'd like to escort you to a federal installation nearby. Colonel Monroe has authorized a private audience." I don't know what surprised me more, that the colonel was alive and pulling strings, or that they wanted me, a waitress from Eastern Oregon with a worn flannel coat and soup-stained shoes, to come see him. The drive took over an hour. We passed through back roads and what looked like forgotten timber routes, winding until we reached a hill with buildings that didn't advertise what they were. The kind of place that would have looked like a fishery or a water treatment plant to anyone else. Only it wasn't. Once inside, I was asked to hand over my phone and anything electronic. Then they led me down a hall lined with photos, faces I didn't recognize, uniforms from a dozen different eras. At the end was a conference room. No windows, just a long table, a stack of folders, and a man in a pressed uniform waiting with a tablet in hand. "Delaney," he said, standing. "I'm Colonel Whitaker. Thank you for coming." I nodded, too overwhelmed to respond. He got right to it. "Your father wasn't just a medic," he said, pulling up a satellite map of Cold War-era Germany on the wall screen. "He was part of an elite reconnaissance unit operating behind the Iron Curtain. The night captured in that photo, the one where he rescued Colonel Monroe, it wasn't just a bad patrol." He tapped the screen. "It was a mission that stopped a military misstep from escalating into something far worse. Something nuclear. Everything about it has remained sealed for decades." I stared at the blinking red circles on the map. It looked like a war board from a movie, only this wasn't fiction. "He carried Monroe on his back for over 3 miles, Whitaker continued, with 3 bullet wounds of his own. He wouldn't stop until he reached safety. After that night, Colonel Monroe made a vow. Not out of duty, out of something deeper. He believed your father saved more than his life. He believed James Cooper saved the world." I couldn't speak. Not at first. The weight of that sentence just hung there in the air, too big for the room. "He's watched over you," the colonel added, sliding a file toward me. "More than you know." Inside were documents, bank records, letters, insurance policies, all showing how, over the last decade, someone had anonymously stepped in to cover gaps in our lives. The insurance payout for Dad's heart surgery. A mysterious scholarship fund that covered my first year of college. The time our rent was suddenly reduced after a glitch in the management system. All connected. All part of a silent promise being fulfilled. Whitaker leaned forward, his voice gentler now. "When he learned of your father's passing, he decided to pass the torch. And he chose to do it in person." My throat tightened. "But why as a homeless man? Why not just, tell me?" The colonel smiled faintly. "Because that's how men like him operate. They test the world first. They wait for the moment that feels right." He reached into a case beside him and pulled out something I hadn't seen in years. Dad's old medic cap. The one from the photograph. The one with the red stitching. "He wanted you to have this," Whitaker said. "He said you earned it." I ran my fingers over the fabric, the brim still stiff, but worn smooth where fingers had once gripped it in the cold. That night, back in my apartment, I sat by the tree with Mom and told her everything. I showed her the cap, the files, the truth that had been unfolding behind our lives like a shadow we never noticed until it stepped into the light. And then I made a decision. The next morning, I called the local college. I asked about their pre-med program, and I started filling out applications. The first day of January found me standing outside the Veterans Outreach office in Bend, Oregon. The building looked modest, brick facade, a dusty American flag swaying on a pole, but I'd never been more nervous stepping through a door. The letter Colonel Whitaker handed me before we parted had included a name, Evelyn Marsh, Director of Veteran Community Engagement, and a note in Colonel Monroe's script. "A new chapter begins when the next hand reaches back." Inside, the air smelled of old paper and freshly brewed coffee. Flyers covered the walls, support groups, winter coat drives, therapy programs. Evelyn was exactly how I imagined a person in charge of something this sacred would be. Tall, composed, kind eyes with an edge of steel. She looked like someone who'd fought for everything she had, and I respected that immediately. "You must be Delaney," she said, offering her hand. "He told us you'd come." I blinked. "He did. Colonel Monroe has his ways," she said, and her eyes twinkled like she'd seen her share of miracles. "He said you had the heart for this. We believe him." She told me about a program the VA was launching, a winter relief initiative focused on connecting young people with aging or homeless veterans. Someone had made a sizable anonymous donation to fund it. My name, apparently, was on the top of the suggested ambassadors list. Would I be qualified? I asked, half doubting myself. Evelyn gave a soft laugh. You sat with a stranger on Christmas Eve and offered soup and kindness without asking a thing in return. That qualifies you more than half the world, sweetheart. And just like that, I said yes. Within weeks, I found myself juggling volunteer shifts with pre-med coursework, balancing biology labs with care packages and hot meal drop-offs. Some days I helped veterans fill out complicated forms. Other days, I just sat and listened to stories that spilled out between breaths. War, loss, love, regret, things they hadn't told anyone else in decades. Each story made me feel closer to Dad. I started to realize that the legacy Monroe talked about wasn't just a dramatic phrase, it was a real thread. A connection that passed from one person to the next, strengthened not by blood or orders, but by choice, by acts of kindness. Then, one snowy evening in February, I got a call from Raymond Locke. Miss Cooper, he said, Colonel Monroe would like to speak with you, privately. He won't be visible on any system. No Zoom, no location sharing, just voice. He sent over a secure link. A minute later, I was staring at a dark screen, my laptop microphone blinking. And then his voice, stronger this time. Delaney, he said, you've done well. I felt a lump rise in my throat. I didn't do anything special. That's where you're wrong, he replied. Compassion without an audience is the rarest kind. There was a long pause, and I imagined him sitting somewhere warm now, maybe in a quiet room filled with maps and dusty books, far from the cold wind that once whistled through our cafe door. I meant to tell you something that night, he continued, but I wasn't sure if you were ready. I leaned closer. In 1972, I carried a document out of enemy territory, he said. That paper redirected the movements of 2 major NATO divisions. If it had fallen into the wrong hands, the world might have seen its last Christmas that year. I blinked. Dad never said. Because the story wasn't about him, he replied. To your father, the world wasn't worth saving unless he could do it quietly. He carried me through snow and blood and darkness. And he didn't want recognition. He wanted peace. He wanted you to grow up in a world that didn't need men like him. He paused and then added, the fund we set up for you, it's matured. Any education you want, any training. It's covered. Tears welled in my eyes. He wanted me to be a doctor. I know, he said. He told me. Said if anyone could fix what this world breaks, it'd be his girl. The call ended there. No dramatic sign-off. Just silence. But it was the kind of silence that filled a room with meaning. It was early March when I received the package. No return address. Just my name written in crisp handwriting that looked more like calligraphy than anything you'd see on a modern envelope. Inside was a polished wooden box, velvet-lined. Nestled inside, a bronze medallion shimmered under the soft light from my desk lamp. I recognized the engraving immediately. It was Dad's unit crest. The very one he'd worn on his dog tags, and the patch tucked away in the bottom drawer of his nightstand. Beneath the metal lay a folded piece of parchment, thick and formal. At the top, United States Department of Defense, in memoriam and honor. It stated, in precise language, that James Cooper was posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, a medal reserved for acts of extraordinary heroism. It detailed the rescue operation in Germany, his unwavering commitment under fire, and the strategic impact his actions had on preserving Cold War peace. It also said something I'd never heard out loud. He saved the lives of not only his comrades, but likely millions more. Tears blurred the words. For so long, Dad had just been Dad. The man who whistled while frying eggs. The guy who fixed broken faucets with duct tape. The one who used to sneak tiny candy bars into my school lunches and pretend he had no idea how they got there. I never imagined he'd been someone whose courage shaped history. That week, a formal representative from Colonel Monroe's team visited our home. His name was Alan Price, soft-spoken, older, with a cane and a smile that reached his eyes. He handed me a folder, inside of which were details about the educational trust Monroe had funded in my name. Colonel said he wanted to remove the how from your dreams, Alan said. You already knew the why. He gave me a single manila envelope before he left. This is from the Colonel himself, he added. Said to give it to you once you knew everything. Inside that envelope was a single-page letter, hand-signed. Delaney. Your father was the kind of man this world needs more of and never fully deserves. He gave me my life. I have spent the better part of mine trying to live in a way that honored that gift. You saw a tired old man and gave him soup. I saw in you the same compassion that carried me through a frozen field in the dark of night. I saw your father's strength in the way you didn't hesitate. I saw his legacy in the warmth of your kindness. You are his daughter in every way. Use the gift. Make something of it. And when the time comes, when you see someone alone in the cold, offer them something warm. A bowl of soup. A kind word. A moment of light. It's all we really have to pass on. With deep respect. E. Monroe. I kept the letter inside my journal, the one where I scribbled dreams and anatomy notes and memories I wasn't ready to say out loud. Every so often I'd pull it out just to feel close to the man who'd appeared like a ghost and left like a guardian angel. As the weeks passed, I got deeper into my classes. Human biology. Chemistry. I hadn't studied this hard since high school, but something inside me had shifted. It wasn't about the grades, it was about earning the gift that had been left in my care. And slowly, people around town began to notice something had changed. I wasn't the quiet girl behind the coffee counter anymore. I was Delaney Cooper, future doctor, veterans advocate, and maybe, just maybe, the next link in a very long chain of kindness that had begun in the snow nearly 50 years ago. By the time December rolled around again, everything looked different, even if most of it hadn't changed. The Evergreen Cafe still stood right where it had always been. Same humming neon sign. Same sticky countertop with the crack in the laminate near the register. But this year, the Christmas lights outside glowed a little brighter. The warmth inside felt a little deeper. Because this time, I wasn't behind the counter refilling coffee mugs. I was hosting. It started with an idea. Small. Simple. A conversation with Evelyn at the veterans office. What if, I asked, we turned the cafe into a safe place on Christmas Eve? Just one night. A warm meal. No questions asked. She smiled. What if you didn't just host it, but named it? And that's how it became the Sullivan Table, named after James Cooper, my father, though we used the name from his military records. It sounded less like a memorial and more like a tradition. The cafe's owner, Ray, who had once muttered about staying open past 8 p.m., surprised me by volunteering to help cook. Local volunteers signed up to serve. A local bakery donated pies. A mechanic paid for the utilities that night. Word spread faster than I ever imagined. By 6 p.m. on Christmas Eve, every table was full, elderly veterans, single parents with kids, travelers passing through who had nowhere else to go. We played carols on the old jukebox, which miraculously worked for once, and the cafe glowed with more life than I'd ever seen in it. One table, though, stayed empty. It was the same booth from the year before, the window booth where Colonel Monroe once sat with a bowl of soup and a gingerbread cookie. I placed a single red napkin on it, a framed photo of my dad in uniform, and beside it, his old medic cap. No one touched that booth. It wasn't for eating. It was for remembering. And then, just as we were serving dessert, a young boy came through the door. No older than 10, bundled in a jacket 2 sizes too big. A social worker I recognized was right behind him. She gave me a nod. He's in the system. Lost both parents this fall. Quiet kid. Doesn't talk much. I knelt beside him. Hey, I said gently. Would you like to sit at this table with me? He stared at the photo, then at the cap. Was he a soldier? He was a healer, I said, setting a plate of gingerbread cookies on the table. Someone who helped people when they needed it most. He slid into the booth without a word, his eyes never leaving the photo. I sat across from him, and for a moment, the noise of the cafe faded. It was just us. And Dad. And the gentle hum of something unspoken being passed from one generation to the next. The social worker watched from the doorway. She didn't interrupt. Just nodded again and stepped back outside. By the end of the night, the boy had eaten 2 cookies and most of a slice of pie. He even smiled when I showed him the Christmas ornaments hanging on the tiny tree I'd brought from home. I don't know if he understood who my dad was or what that cap meant, but I think he felt safe. And sometimes, that's the only message that really matters. After we closed up, Ray handed me an envelope someone had left at the front. No name. Just a note inside. The circle continues. Well done. No signature. But I didn't need one. Somewhere out there, I knew Monroe was watching. Or maybe it was someone else now. A new link in the chain. All I knew for sure was that kindness, once given, doesn't vanish. It circles back. A week after Christmas, I received a call from the dean's office at Cascade Medical College. Miss Cooper, the voice said, we'd like to offer you a place in our upcoming class. Full scholarship. Books and housing included. I stood there frozen, a dish towel still in my hand from cleaning up the kitchen. Did Colonel Monroe? The voice paused. Your application spoke volumes. But yes, there was a recommendation. A strong one. They emailed me the letter. It was short, elegant, typed. This candidate possesses not only the discipline to endure the path ahead, but the heart to change it. I would trust her with my life, because someone I trusted with mine raised her. That was it. I enrolled that afternoon. My mom cried when I told her. We didn't have much to celebrate with, but she lit a cinnamon candle, poured hot cocoa, and we sat on the couch, watching the snow fall. Later that night, as I packed for orientation, I found a small box on my bed. It was Dad's field journal. I had never seen it before. Inside the front cover, written in his familiar all-caps scrawl, "For Delaney, when you're ready." Page after page, he wrote about missions, frustrations, small joys. But every few entries, one phrase appeared again and again. Stay human. That's the hardest part. I closed the journal and held it to my chest. I was ready now. Medical school wasn't easy. The hours were brutal. The material, overwhelming. But every time I thought about quitting, every time I stared down a long night of anatomy flashcards or flunked a practice quiz, I thought of Dad's journal, and Monroe's quiet visit, and that little boy who sat at the Sullivan table without saying a word. I carried them with me. One morning, during our clinical rotations, I was assigned to the VA hospital across town. My supervising doctor gave me a file. Room 206. Patient, Everett Monroe. I froze. When I entered, he was sitting by the window, back straight, eyes alert. You're late, he said without looking at me. You'll make a terrible doctor if you don't learn to knock first. I smiled. And you'll make a terrible patient if you keep reading my chart before I get here. He chuckled, a real, quiet laugh. We didn't talk about the past. Not directly. Instead, he let me check his vitals while he told stories about German winters, codes hidden in children's songs, and the time your father borrowed a Russian field radio just to listen to a baseball game. Before I left, he handed me a folded napkin. Inside, a silver pin. A single, engraved word. Steady. Keep it with you, he said. Especially when things get loud. I wore it under my coat every day after that. Spring came fast that year. Between hospital rounds and study groups, I barely had time to breathe, but every now and then, I'd return to the cafe. Ray had hung Dad's photo behind the counter, next to the Sullivan table plaque. The gingerbread cookies were now a year-round staple. Locals called them Doc's cookies. One afternoon, I stopped by to drop off flyers for the next winter relief drive. As I turned to leave, Ray called out, "You've got mail." It was a single sheet of paper. No envelope. Just a typed message and a date. Christmas Eve. Same booth. If you believe in tradition. I knew who it was from. That December, the cafe was packed again. But I kept booth 5 open. A red napkin. The cap. A plate of cookies. The clock hit 11:52 p.m. The bell over the door chimed. But no one walked in. Instead, a young woman stepped up to the counter and handed me a note. "He asked me to deliver this," she said, then disappeared into the crowd. The note was handwritten, careful and steady. "You've done more than keep a promise. You've made it stronger. Wherever I am next Christmas, booth 5 is yours. Keep it warm. Keep it kind. Yem." I folded the note, tucked it into Dad's journal, and looked around the room. Veterans laughed with teenagers. A woman offered a warm coat to a man with frostbitten hands. A boy hung an ornament on the tiny tree. This was the legacy now. Not secrets. Not medals. Just simple acts done right. The next Christmas Eve came quietly. No fanfare. Just snow whispering across the roads and the faint buzz of neon from the Evergreen Cafe sign. Inside, booth 5 was already set. The red napkin. Dad's medic cap. A plate of cookies, still warm. I placed a fresh photo next to his. This one of me, wearing my white coat for the first time. Underneath it, a note. "Thanks, Dad. I made it." The cafe was full again. Travelers, veterans, new faces, old regulars. A community stitched together by warm food and the unspoken agreement that no one should be alone on Christmas. Around 8 p.m., a boy walked in with a woman who looked like she hadn't slept in days. They sat near the heater, silent and unsure. I brought them a plate of cookies. "First time here?" I asked. The woman nodded. "We heard about this place. Someone said, no one leaves hungry." "You heard right," I said, sliding into the booth beside them. You're exactly where you're supposed to be. Later that night, as the final guests trickled out, I stood alone at booth 5. I touched the brim of the cap, just briefly, and whispered, "Still here." As I turned to lock up, I noticed something taped under the table. A folded napkin. Inside, a note in fresh ink. "New watch begins. Stay steady. M." No signature. But I didn't need one. The circle wasn't closed. It was still moving, quietly, steadily, just like Dad would have wanted. And next Christmas, booth 5 will still be waiting.